So what I want to do is a little bit different from what the prior speakers have done. I want to speak about a kind of more big picture project, a book project I'm currently working on. And that project is entitled Fear and Hope in the Anthropocene, Utopian Thinking and Acting for Our Times. But I do think that many of the things I'm alluding to and talking about in a few minutes now will connect to the topics that have already been touched upon. So the project really grew out of an interest of mine in the potential of utopianism more broadly and of utopian studies as a discipline more narrowly to shed light on some of the most pressing problems that political theorists are currently grappling with. I'm a political theorist and I try to learn in this particular book project from utopian studies as well as inform utopian studies. Now what I want to do in the presentation is to quickly tell you about the idea, the basic idea behind the project and the methodological apparatus I'm using in order to approach the problem. And then I want to unpack quickly an illustrative case study that perhaps emblematically demonstrates how I want to approach particular debates around climate change through the lens of utopianism. And finally, perhaps a look ahead if there's still time for that. So the basic idea behind this project is that the challenge of thinking through the practical and theoretical implications of climate change forces us to engage in utopian reflections, whether we want that or not. And I think that starting point resonates with things that Lauren talked about at the beginning of our session today, where she emphasized, if I understood correctly, the fact that we currently find ourselves, as Amitav Ghosh calls it, the great derangement. The fact that we are in this current moment necessitates the creation, proliferation, and sustaining of new ways of orienting ourselves, of radically new ways of orienting ourselves. And my starting hypothesis is that utopianism can be one way into these new ways of orienting ourselves. Now, of course, the question is, how do I define utopianism? I define utopianism very broadly as the education of the desire for a better way of being and living. So that kind of definition can partly be traced back to Ernst Bloch's magisterial oeuvre, but its more recent appropriations are perhaps in the works of Miguel Abonsur and Ruth Levitas. The definition of utopianism as the education of desire also echoes Frederick Jemisin's notion that utopianism compellingly formulates an answer to the universal ideological conviction that no alternative is possible. So given this broad definition, we might even think that perhaps the multi-species project that you are pursuing here in Sydney could be described as utopian in a particular sense. So the desire to break the spell of the status quo, the utopian desire, can fulfill at least three different functions. First, it can compensate for a feeling of lack and deprivation, as has been the case, for example, with the medieval story of cocaine, a narrative about satiation, complete satiation, and material abundance, which could only arise within the social environment marked by extreme hunger and poverty. So that's one element, compensation. Secondly, utopianism can also proffer a transient critique of the status quo by holding up a mirror to society, often with the help of satire and hyperbole. So the literary genre of utopia has typically played this specific role, from its very inception with Thomas More to the more recent rise of science fiction as the literature of estrangement. Thirdly, utopianism can finally become a catalyst for social change in the real world. Through different kinds of social dreaming. In this last sense, utopias cross over from merely imagining other worlds to making those other worlds possible, here and now. So to illustrate this third function, perhaps just think of the official slogan of the World Social Forum, another world is possible. That's a very strongly utopian idea, I believe. So utopianism as the education of the desire for a better way of being and living is multifaceted, not only with regard to the various functions it can fulfill, but also in regard to the sites, for lack of better word, it occupies. I think there's a tendency in public discourse to associate utopianism primarily with the fictional conjuring of other worlds, be it through literature, cinema, or other art forms. And there are good reasons, obviously, to connect utopianism with artistic production in particular. So after all, in the West, for example, we can look back on a 500-year-long tradition of utopian imagining through storytelling. And despite long-standing reservations about the universality of utopianism, non-Western utopian traditions have an equally, if not longer, historical arc. So the ensemble of all these traditions is immensely rich and variegated, offering contemporary writers, filmmakers, and artists a seemingly bottomless well of inspiration. But we mustn't lose sight of two other sides in which utopianism has been thriving as well, namely social and political theory on the one hand, and experiments in communal living on the other. So within social and political theory, utopianism has occupied a prominent place, at least since Plato's Republic. Today, the question of utopianism is once again of very great importance, especially within debates around idealism, feasibility, and realism. But comparatively less known is perhaps the significance of utopianism for social experiments that strive to organize life in ways that often radically clash with the mainstream. So-called intentional communities, such as eco-villages, for example, have frequently been described as utopian in both spirit and practice. Utopianism is moreover part of the anarchist strategy of prefigurative politics. So we can also see this kind of practical element of utopianism in a variety of political contexts. So final aspect in terms of kind of simply conceptual clearing up landscape, a final aspect I would like to highlight here concerns the intermingling of utopian and dystopian motives within current utopianism. As several commentators have explained, utopian fiction since the 1970s has undergone a critical turn, reflecting on the perils of imagining a better way of being and living, while remaining committed to the importance of utopian desire as a catalyst of real-world change. So if you think about a paradigmatic example of this sort of critical utopia, you might be drawn to especially Ursula Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed. So utopian storytelling today is typically very attentive to the anti-totalitarian critique of utopianism that emerged during the Cold War, the so-called Cold War liberal critique of utopianism, which I think of someone like Karl Popper, for instance. So starting with this kind of conceptual toolbox that contains various elements, I want to say a little bit more about the benefits of approaching controversies around climate change in terms of distinct forms of utopianism. And the first thing to admit here is that I'm not the first person to think about these debates through this lens. I came across it at least two different authors, namely firstly Marcel Legois from 1999 and Lisa Garforth just from last year have pursued very similar intuitions, trying very helpfully, I think, to reconstruct both the history of ideas about the environment and relatively recent ecological movements as expressions of utopianism. And my own book tries to build on those findings, but also go significantly beyond it. And here is how. So I believe a great deal of utopias distributed across the three sites mentioned before exist at the moment and vie for our attention. So just consider for a moment the numerous examples of climate fiction that have already started to receive very significant scholarly attention within the environmental humanities especially. My book attempts to elaborate on these debates so as to achieve a better sense of how exactly these utopias look like, what tropes they employ, what assumptions they make, and what purposes they serve. In that sense, the book understands and interprets utopias as attempts at delivering orientation in the sense that Lauren talked about at the beginning. I therefore seek to not only capture the complexity of existing utopian projects around climate change, but also to assess them critically and normatively. The ultimate goal then is to separate out cases of contemporary utopianism that avoid two opposing fallacies, what I consider to be fallacies. Namely, firstly, a fatalism that renders any form of dissident action in the face of climate change pointless, and on the other hand, a naive kind of wishful thinking that fails to take seriously the actual challenges that lie ahead. In other words, my ambition in the book is to unpack a number of utopian constellations that reveal something crucial about the way our common future is imagined. And I take the idea of a constellation from Walter Benjamin, and his interpretation of how ideas relate to the material world. More concretely, I want to focus on at least 3 different constellations. Firstly, the proposal to envisage planet Earth as a living being. Secondly, the eco-modernist wager of investing hope in science and technology to create a good Anthropocene. And thirdly, collapse and apocalypse as realistic outcomes of the perfect moral storm we're currently weathering. So I've decided to focus in the book on these 3 constellations, not only because they strike me as particularly palpable in the contemporary debate, but also because they operate on somewhat different speculative registers. So what do I mean here by a speculative register? In a self-reflective piece shortly before her death, Octavia Butler, the great science fiction author, once came up with an ingenious distinction between 3 broad categories of science fiction writing: the what if, the if only, and the if this goes on. And she thought that we can categorize all science fiction writing in one of these categories: the what if, the if only, and the if this goes on. And these are competing and to some degree mutually exclusive meta frames that structure specific utopian visions. And I hope to map each of these categories on my 3 constellations. So accordingly, the suggestion to envisage planet Earth as a living being raises a somewhat disconcerting what-if question. What would happen if we managed to perceive planetary life as deeply entangled with one another? The eco-modernist wager in favor of a good Anthropocene, I think, urges us to declaim if only. So what would happen if science and technology were indeed capable of taking on the challenge of climate change? And finally, for grounding collapse and apocalypse in utopian visions, as likely consequences of our action, pushes the reader into the direction of an if this goes on inquiry. So what would happen if irresponsible behavior did not change at all, or if mitigation and adaptation measures simply gained momentum too late? We can already see how these 3 different speculative registers engage utopian and dystopian motives in very different ways. So if only will clearly veer into a more unambiguously utopian direction, whereas if this goes on encourages visions that are more directly shaped by dystopian reflections. Now the what-if question, this is an interesting case in the middle, I think resembles speculation that we know from thought experiments very broadly in political theory, characteristically weaving together utopian and dystopian themes. So I hope that this substantive focus on these 3 utopian constellations and the formal focus on 3 different ways of imagining, the what if, the if only, and the if this goes on, will enable me to delineate a systematic account of utopias in the Anthropocene. And what I want to do quickly now is to show you how I want to do it by talking a little bit more about the what-if case, namely the idea of seeing planet Earth as a living being. So the first utopian constellation revolves around this particular question. What would happen if we managed to perceive planetary life forms as deeply entangled with one another? And I think some of the papers in the morning were actually involved in this sort of imagining, or urging us to imagine, to see things differently. I'm looking especially at you, Blanche. You're nodding here as well. That's good. So I trace, in the book, I trace this question within 2 separate contexts, namely in separate contexts that bridge political and social theory and fiction writing. Namely in Bruno Latour's argument for a reinvigorated political ecology, articulated via his recovery of the Gaia figure. And on the other hand, in N.K. Jemisin's fantasy writing, in particular her Broken Earth trilogy, which won her various accolades in the science fiction fantasy community. So the crux of the chapter is that seeing planet Earth as a living being summons the readers to radically alter their interpretive frameworks through which they envision their own place in the world. So Latour and Jemisin, a social and political theorist on the one hand from France, and an African-American science fiction writer, perform this critical function in very different ways, but they can be usefully, I think, compared with each other. Let me quickly say something about Latour, who we've already encountered, I think, in Petra's paper. So Latour's attention to a novel politics of nature is embedded in his much farther-reaching actor network theory, which has become one of the most important schools of thought in STS. A central plank in Latour's reflections about such a politics concerns the distinction between culture and nature. So this distinction is for Latour foundational to all of humanity, and its current erosion is taken as a chance to what he calls assemble a parliament of things. Latour thus claims that once we acknowledge that a sharp separation of culture and nature cannot be upheld, new forms of doing politics will necessarily reveal themselves. I think this insight has very strong and important ramifications for how green politics more specifically should be conceived. Against prevailing ideas about the ultimate goal of green politics, Latour maintains that political, and quoting here, political ecology has nothing to do, or rather finally no longer has anything to do with nature, still less with its conservation, protection, or defense. So conserving, protecting, and defending nature is the completely wrong ambition for political ecology, because nature as such simply doesn't exist for Latour. As a modern invention, the environmentalist idea of nature, or wild nature, inadvertently serves to stabilize the opposing idea of human culture, and hence it cannot supply a properly political basis for humanity's reckoning with the environment. So if this kind of route towards a new, invigorated political ecology is cut off, how should we think about it more properly? And this is where the idea of our planet as a living being comes into play. Drawing on James Lovelock's model for understanding the Earth system, Latour maintains that the Gaia figure provides a suitable framework for what he calls a new climate regime that is emphatically positioned after nature. As you will know, Lovelock's revolutionary idea of the living planet is open to many competing interpretations, some of which assimilate the Gaia hypothesis to more New Age obscurantism, while others stress its explanatory potential in terms of scientific inquiry. Boiled down to a succinct formula, the essence of Latour's interpretation can be expressed as connectivity without holism. So we think about connections, but not in terms of a holistically organized organism that stands somehow above the connected elements. So this formula does away not only with the modern notion of nature, but also with the image of Gaia as an infinitely intricate machine that underpins cybernetic theories of Earth. Consequently, Latour is vehemently opposed to proposals for a good Anthropocene in which humanity may wish to reassert its supremacy over the planet. So the gist of Latour's account is that humanity is always already entangled in the planetary network called Gaia. But interestingly, this entanglement doesn't take the shape of a deep ecological harmony between humanity and its environment. Rather, Latour consistently emphasizes the antagonistic character of all planetary relationships. So fantasies of dominating Earth or of colonizing other planets are for him mere expressions of wishful thinking. What is needed instead is a new kind of politics that accepts its own grounding within Gaia, its own place down to Earth, to cite another title of his books. So this is kind of one part of the chapter. The other part is turning to the science fiction author N.K. Jemisin, whose Broken Earth trilogy consists of fantasy novels published in very quick succession. The Fifth Season in 2015, The Obelisk Gate in 2016, and The Stone Sky in 2017. So the world of the Broken Earth trilogy is set in a far future Earth, characterized by dramatic geological turmoil. Stillness, the continent on which the main story unfolds, is frequently ravaged by intense climate catastrophes that devastate the Earth's surface for long periods of time. These catastrophes are called seasons, and they come and go in very unexpected waves. Besides the surviving humans, other beings as well inhabit this world. There's a small number of people who possess extraordinary magical powers, it's a fantasy novel after all, to control the fluctuations, eruptions during a season. The gift of these orogenes, named after the ability to create mountains, is extremely dangerous when left unchecked. So rather than quelling geological turmoil, their magical power can also cause absolute ruin. And just as with Latour's revitalization of the Gaia figure, the central theme in the Broken Earth trilogy is the permanence of conflict between humanity and its environment. Jemisin's epic plot revolves around the struggles of an anti-hero, Essun, who seeks to save her only surviving child from the fate that she herself had to suffer, namely living in disguise as one of those magicians amongst humans. The story then takes the reader through various stages, culminating in the final scene that restores humanity's relationship with Father Earth to a more balanced equilibrium. So the Earth is always described as Father Earth, not as Mother Earth. Throughout the trilogy, our planet is depicted as a living being, irascible and vengeful, and part of the conclusion centers around explaining why it has become so hot-tempered in the first place. So spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, it is to do with humanity's exploitative and extractive tendencies. So what I do in the chapter on Jemisin, I try to draw out some of the key motives that run through the narrative, namely this idea of planet Earth as a living being, the role of cyclical violence in human and in cross-species relations, and thirdly, the place of altruism and solidarity in response to cyclical violence, especially apocalyptic moments. And I believe that these three motives together strengthen the case for arguing that the Broken Earth trilogy is a work of utopian fiction, despite the fact that the plot is set in a landscape that's the complete opposite of an Akkadian place. So I think reading together Latour and Jemisin reveals a number of overlapping preoccupations. The first of these is that the rejection is the rejection of an image of Earth as a caring, nurturing figure. So what both authors here, I think, want to intimate is there is no place for such an image in a world ravaged by climate disruptions. The second concern shared by Latour and Jemisin is to do with the essentially conflictual character of human and interspecies relations as well. So their emphasis on persistent antagonism can perhaps be explained as an endeavor to repoliticize ecology in a radical way, not as in Max Weber's thinking as the slow, strong drilling through hard boards, but as the fact of being exposed to constant risk and danger. And the third, I think, interest concerns what should happen next. Neither Latour nor Jemisin are fatalistic about the future. They do not come up with a roadmap out of the current impasse, but they impress on us a clear sense of how oppositional agency can gather traction. So maybe to wrap up what I want to say, so what I want to say is that this particular way of reflecting in a utopian fashion about the future is done in the manner of a what-if thought experiment. Yeah? Essentially, both Gaia, I think, and the stillness embody elaborate thought experiments that strive to fundamentally shift the way we see the world. So what is typical of this kind of speculation is that it weaves together utopian and dystopian tropes. It's not unambiguously positive and not unambiguously negative. Latour's vision of earthbound life is both more limited and more expansive than the world we currently inhabit. Jemisin's portrait of Father Earth is at the same time more frightening and more reassuring than our actual planet can ever be. So what's interesting about this particular mode of speculation, I think, is that the desire for a better way of living and being is conditioned and constrained by an acknowledgement of the conflicts and contradictions that will prevail in an uncertain future, rather than simply disavow those contradictions. But there's a downside, of course, to this sort of reflection, namely that it doesn't tell us a lot about what we should do here and now. It's a kind of a form of radical estrangement that is at play when we read a fantasy novel, or I think when we try to really think through what the Gaia hypothesis would mean for us. And I think that's where, I don't have time to talk about it now, that's where the kind of second utopian constellation, the eco-modernist wager of investing hope in technology and science, can offer a contrasting perspective. So here the purpose is really to find solutions here and now, and imagining a sort of Promethean vision of science and technology that can redeem us in the current crisis. So I did something probably a bit crazy by talking about a whole book in 20 minutes, but I hope I've given you a bit of a sense of what I want to achieve, and I'm really happy to hear your feedback. Thank you so much. Thank you.